The cardiac monitor's shrill alarm pierced the emergency room silence as Frank Morrison, 67, lay unconscious on the gurney, his soaking wet clothes dripping chlorinated water onto the sterile hospital floor. Outside the glass doors, a 400-pound African lion sat motionless in the parking lot, golden eyes fixed on the building where his savior fought for life. The old man jumped into freezing water to save a damn lion, the paramedic whispered to Dr. Torres, shaking his head in disbelief. It wasn't just any rescue. Security footage showed the impossible, Frank Morrison performing CPR on a wild animal while suffering his own massive heart attack. Sarah Morrison Davidson burst through the automatic doors, her designer heels clicking frantically against linoleum as nurses scrambled around her father's still form. The coffee cup slipped from her trembling fingers, shattering against the floor as she saw his purple heart medal clutched in his blue-tinged hand. 3 years of bitter silence between them, and now this. "Get the defibrillator ready," Dr. Torres commanded, though his voice carried little hope. Why would a dying man risk everything for a beast that could kill him? And what was that lion still doing outside, refusing all attempts to move him away? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Frank Morrison had sat in the sterile oncology office where his beloved wife Mary had received her death sentence, only this time the bad news was meant for him. Doctor. Patricia Chen's words echoed in the small examination room like a judge reading a verdict. "Mr. Morrison, with your heart condition progressing this rapidly, I'd recommend getting your affairs in order. 6 months? Maybe less." Frank stared at the EKG printout showing his damaged heart, the irregular lines reminding him of shrapnel patterns he'd seen 40 years ago in Vietnam. His calloused fingers traced the Purple Heart in his shirt pocket, a medal he'd carried for decades, earned through blood and sacrifice that no one knew the full truth about. At 67, Frank Morrison was a man shaped by loss. His wife Mary, 3 years gone from cancer they couldn't afford to treat properly. His daughter Sarah estranged and living 1,200 miles away in California. And now his own ticker ready to quit on him. The Big Cat Sanctuary in the Texas Hill Country had become Frank's refuge after Mary's funeral. What started as volunteer work soon became a paying job when Margaret Collins, the 74-year-old owner, offered him night security shifts. The pay wasn't much, barely enough to cover his mounting medical bills, but it gave him purpose. More importantly, it gave him Caesar. Caesar was a 15-year-old African lion, rescued 5 years ago from a bankrupt circus where he'd been kept in a cage barely large enough for a dog. When the magnificent beast first arrived at the sanctuary, he'd refused to eat, spending his days lying motionless in the corner of his enclosure. Frank recognized the look in those amber eyes, the same hollow stare he'd seen in his own mirror after returning from Southeast Asia, the same expression Mary had worn during her final weeks. Every night, Frank would sit outside Caesar's enclosure during his security rounds, talking to the lion about Mary, about the war, about the way grief felt like carrying a stone in your chest that never got lighter. Gradually, Caesar began responding, first just lifting his massive head when Frank arrived, then moving closer to the fence, eventually lying near enough that Frank could almost touch the golden fur through the chain link. Sarah Morrison Davidson lived in a different world entirely. At 40, she was a successful divorce attorney in Los Angeles, her Beverly Hills office a testament to her ambition, and her recent divorce settlement providing financial security she'd fought hard to achieve. But success had come at a cost. Her 8-year-old daughter Emma had been diagnosed with high-functioning autism, and Sarah struggled to balance her demanding career with single motherhood. Emma was Frank's pride and joy, the only family member who still called him regularly. During their video chats, the little girl would show him her drawings, usually featuring animals, often lions. Sarah dismissed these conversations as Dad filling Emma's head with nonsense about his zoo animals, never realizing that her daughter possessed an unusual gift for understanding creatures that couldn't speak. The call came at 3:47 a.m. on a sweltering July morning when the Texas heat hadn't dropped below 95 degrees even in the darkness. Margaret Collins' voice cracked through Frank's cell phone, her usual composure shattered by panic. "Frank, you need to get here now. Something's wrong with the water system, and the animals are getting sick." Frank threw on his clothes and drove his battered pickup truck down the winding dirt road to the sanctuary, his headlights cutting through the humid darkness. The Big Cat Sanctuary sprawled across 200 acres of Texas hill country, home to 37 rescued big cats, from tigers saved from roadside zoos to lions like Caesar who'd spent their lives in cramped circus cages. As Frank pulled up to the main facility, he immediately noticed something was off. The usual sounds of the night shift were replaced by an eerie silence broken only by occasional, distressed growls. Margaret met him at the gate, her gray hair disheveled and her hands shaking. "The main water filtration system failed around midnight," she explained, leading him toward the central compound. Emergency backup kicked in, but now the animals that drank from the emergency reservoir are showing signs of poisoning. Caesar's the worst. He's having seizures. Frank's blood ran cold. In the 5 years since Caesar had arrived, the old lion had never been seriously ill. Despite his age and the trauma from his circus days, Caesar had maintained the dignity and strength that had first drawn Frank to him. Now, as they approached Caesar's enclosure, Frank saw his friend lying on his side, powerful body convulsing as foam gathered at the corners of his mouth. "Dr. Whitfield is on his way," Margaret said, referring to the sanctuary's veterinarian. "But he's coming from San Antonio. That's 2 hours, minimum." Frank knelt beside the fence, watching helplessly as Caesar's breathing became more labored. The lion's amber eyes, usually so alert and intelligent, were clouded with confusion and pain. "What kind of poison are we talking about?" Frank asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Margaret handed him a crumpled piece of paper she'd found near the water treatment facility. "Someone left this." The note was brief and threatening. "Take Sterling's offer while you still can. Next time won't be just the water. Jackson Sterling." Frank's jaw tightened as he read the name that had been haunting the sanctuary for months. Sterling Development had been pressuring Margaret to sell the land for a luxury resort project, making increasingly aggressive offers as the sanctuary struggled with mounting debts. The latest offer of $50,000 for land worth nearly $2 million was insulting, but Margaret was desperate. The sanctuary owed $250,000 to various creditors, and foreclosure loomed in just 30 days. Frank had met Jackson Sterling once 6 months ago when the developer had toured the facility with Margaret. Something about the man's cold smile and calculating eyes had reminded Frank of officers he'd known in Vietnam, the kind who saw soldiers as expendable resources rather than human beings. When Sterling learned Frank's name, his expression had shifted almost imperceptibly, and Frank had caught him staring with an intensity that seemed personal rather than professional. Now, as Caesar's condition worsened, Frank understood that Sterling wasn't just after the land. This was deliberate sabotage designed to force a sale. The filtration system hadn't failed. It had been sabotaged. Fresh tool marks on the pipes, security cameras mysteriously malfunctioning during the crucial hours, and now this threatening note. It all pointed to a coordinated attack. Caesar let out a low, pained growl that cut through Frank's anger like a knife. The lion was trying to stand, his powerful legs shaking with the effort, but the poison in his system was winning. Frank had seen enough death in his lifetime, in the jungles of Southeast Asia, in the cancer ward where Mary had spent her final weeks, to recognize when a living creature was losing the fight. 300 miles away in Beverly Hills, Emma Davidson jolted awake from a nightmare that felt more real than any dream should. In her vision, she had seen a large golden cat struggling in dark water, calling out for help that wouldn't come. Her mother Sarah found her 20 minutes later sitting on her bedroom floor drawing frantically with her crayons, a picture of a man and a lion both underwater, the man's arms wrapped around the great cat as if trying to save it. "Emma, honey, it's just a bad dream," Sarah said, kneeling beside her daughter. But Emma's drawings had always been unusually detailed and specific, almost like photographs of scenes she couldn't possibly have witnessed. "It's not a dream, Mommy," Emma whispered, her voice carrying the certainty that only children possessed. "Grandpa Frank's big kitty is in trouble. He's going to try to save him, but the water is too deep." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Emma's connection to her grandfather was unusually strong, and her drawings often seemed to predict events before they happened. Just last month, Emma had drawn a picture of rain falling on their house 2 days before an unexpected thunderstorm hit Los Angeles. Sarah had dismissed it as coincidence, but now she wasn't so sure. Back in Texas, Frank made a decision that would change everything. Caesar's seizures were getting worse, and the emergency pond where the poisoned animals had been drinking was now the only water source available. The main system was completely offline. If Caesar, in his disoriented state, tried to drink more of the contaminated water, it would kill him. But the poison was also causing severe dehydration, and without water he would die anyway. Frank called Sarah's number, knowing it was early morning in California, but needing to hear his daughter's voice. When she answered, groggy and irritated, he almost lost his nerve. "Dad, do you know what time it is?" Sarah's voice was sharp with annoyance. "I have a deposition in 3 hours." "Honey, I just wanted to tell you that I love you," Frank said, watching Caesar struggle to breathe. "And I need you to know that everything I did because I thought it was right." "Dad, are you drinking again?" Sarah's tone softened slightly, but Frank could hear the familiar distance creeping in. "We've talked about this. You can't keep calling me when you're—" "I'm not drinking," Frank interrupted. I need you to take care of Emma. Tell her that Grandpa's cats need help and that sometimes the right thing to do is the hardest thing to do." "Dad, you're scaring me. What's going on?" Frank looked at Caesar, whose breathing was becoming more shallow. Dr. Whitfield was still an hour away, and Frank could see that his friend didn't have an hour left. "I have to go, sweetheart. Just remember that I love you." He hung up before Sarah could respond, knowing that if he heard the worry in her voice, he might lose his resolve. Frank Morrison had spent 40 years carrying the weight of decisions made in impossible circumstances. Tonight, faced with another impossible choice, he would trust his instincts one more time. The emergency pond sat like a dark mirror in the pre-dawn darkness, its surface reflecting the sanctuary's security lights with an oily sheen that Frank knew meant trouble. Caesar had dragged himself to the water's edge, his massive body trembling with fever and dehydration. The lion's instincts were driving him toward the very thing that would kill him, more of the contaminated water that had already poisoned his system. Frank moved slowly, his own heart hammering irregularly in his chest as the stress triggered the cardiac symptoms his doctor had warned him about. Every step felt like walking through quicksand, but he couldn't let Caesar drink from that pond. As he approached, the lion turned those clouded amber eyes toward him, and Frank saw something that broke his heart: trust. Even in his poisoned, confused state, Caesar recognized the man who had spent countless nights talking to him through the fence. "Easy, old friend," Frank whispered, reaching slowly toward Caesar's massive head. "I know you're thirsty, but that water's no good for you." Caesar's breathing was labored, each exhale accompanied by a rattling sound that Frank recognized from his time in military field hospitals. The lion was dying, and they both knew it. But as Frank knelt beside the great cat, Caesar did something unexpected. He leaned into Frank's touch, pressing his enormous head against the old man's chest as if seeking comfort. That gesture of trust decided everything for Frank. Caesar wasn't just dying, he was suffering, and the emergency pond was calling to him like a siren song. The contaminated water would end his pain quickly, but it would also end any chance of survival if Dr. Whitfield arrived with the antidote. Frank made his choice with the same instinctive certainty that had guided him through combat zones decades earlier. Caesar lurched toward the water, his coordination destroyed by the toxins coursing through his bloodstream. The lion's powerful legs, which had once carried him across African plains before his capture, now betrayed him completely. As he reached the pond's edge, Caesar's weight shifted forward, and Frank watched in horror as 400 pounds of poisoned lion toppled into the 12-foot deep water. The splash echoed across the sanctuary like a gunshot. Caesar's golden fur disappeared beneath the dark surface, his massive body sinking like a stone. Lions were not natural swimmers even under the best circumstances, and Caesar's current condition made survival impossible. Frank saw the ripples spreading outward and knew that in 30 seconds, maybe less, his friend would be gone forever. Frank Morrison had made split-second decisions under fire in Vietnam. He had held his dying wife's hand in a hospital room and promised her he would keep fighting. He had watched his daughter walk away from him after their final argument and chosen pride over reconciliation. But none of those moments had felt as clear and absolute as this one. He stripped off his shirt and boots, revealing the surgical scars that crisscrossed his chest like a road map of old battles. The Purple Heart in his shirt pocket caught the light briefly before Frank set it aside with reverence. His hand shook as he removed his wedding ring, Mary's final gift to him, and placed it carefully beside the medal. "If this is how it ends, Lord, let it mean something," Frank whispered, and dove into the pond. The water was shockingly cold despite the summer heat, and Frank felt his already damaged heart skip several beats as the temperature change hit his system. The pond was deeper than he had realized, and the water was murky from disturbed sediment and floating debris. Frank kicked downward, his lungs burning as he searched for any sign of Caesar in the darkness below. His fingers found fur first, a massive shoulder that felt like a boulder covered in wet carpet. Caesar was unconscious, his great body limp and heavy as Frank struggled to get his arms around the lion's chest. 400 pounds of dead weight felt like trying to lift a car underwater, and Frank realized with growing panic that he lacked the strength to bring Caesar to the surface alone. The old soldier's training kicked in despite his failing heart. Frank positioned himself beneath Caesar, using his legs to push off the pond bottom while pulling the lion upward with everything he had left. His vision began to blur from oxygen deprivation, but he could see the surface above them, tantalizingly close yet seemingly impossible to reach. Frank's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird, each beat sending lightning bolts of pain down his left arm. He recognized the symptoms of cardiac arrest beginning, the same signs he had ignored for months while focusing on Caesar's needs instead of his own health. But giving up now meant they would both die at the bottom of this poisoned pond, and Frank Morrison had not survived Vietnam and 40 years of civilian battles to quit when someone needed him most. With a final surge of desperate strength, Frank broke the surface, gasping and choking as he dragged Caesar's unconscious form toward the shallow end. The lion's head lolled back, mouth open, water streaming from his nostrils. Frank could see no sign of breathing, no flicker of life in those amber eyes that had watched him with such intelligence for 5 years. Frank hauled Caesar onto the concrete edge of the pond, his own vision swimming as his heart struggled to maintain rhythm. Every muscle in his body screamed for oxygen, but Caesar needed immediate attention. Frank had received basic first aid training in the military, but performing CPR on a 400-pound lion was not covered in any manual he had ever read. Kneeling beside Caesar's still form, Frank placed his hands on the lion's massive chest and began compressions. Each push sent shockwaves of pain through his own damaged heart, but he maintained the rhythm he had learned decades ago. 30 compressions, 2 breaths, repeat. The lion's ribs felt like tree trunks beneath Frank's palms, and he wondered if he was even creating enough pressure to restart that great heart. "Come on, Caesar," Frank gasped between compressions. "Don't you give up on me now. Mary's waiting for me, but you're not invited to that party yet." Frank leaned down to give rescue breaths, carefully avoiding the massive canine teeth that could crush a man's skull without effort. Caesar's mouth was enormous, and Frank had to seal his lips around the lion's nose and breathe directly into his nostrils. The taste was wild and unfamiliar, grass and meat and something indefinably feline that spoke of African plains Caesar had never seen but somehow remembered in his DNA. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, Frank felt his own strength failing completely. His left arm had gone numb, and crushing chest pain made each breath a monumental effort. This was how it would end. Both of them dying beside this cursed pond, while Jackson Sterling's men watched from whatever hiding place they had chosen. But as Frank's vision began to fade, he felt Caesar's chest move beneath his hands. A weak cough, then another, and suddenly Caesar was convulsing as pond water poured from his lungs. Those amber eyes opened, unfocused but unmistakably alive, and fixed on Frank's face with an expression that seemed almost human in its gratitude. Frank collapsed beside Caesar, his heart hammering wildly in his chest as he watched his friend struggle back to consciousness. They had both survived, but Frank could feel his own time running out as his cardiac symptoms worsened. Caesar, still weak but breathing steadily, did something extraordinary. He lifted his massive head and began licking Frank's face with a gentleness that seemed impossible from such a powerful predator. As Frank's consciousness faded, the last thing he heard was Caesar's deep, rumbling call echoing across the sanctuary. Not a roar of aggression, but something that sounded remarkably like a cry for help. Margaret Collins found them at dawn, drawn by Caesar's continuous roaring that had echoed across the sanctuary for the past hour. The sight that greeted her defied everything she knew about lions and humans. Caesar, still weak from poisoning but very much alive, positioned protectively over Frank's unconscious form. The great cat's amber eyes tracked Margaret's every movement as she approached, but he made no aggressive moves, only continued his deep, rhythmic calling that seemed designed to summon help. "Dear God," Margaret whispered, pulling out her cell phone to dial 911. Frank lay motionless beside the pond, his lips blue with hypothermia and his breathing so shallow it was barely visible. But Caesar refused to leave his side, even when Margaret tried to approach with a tranquilizer dart. The lion simply placed one massive paw closer to Frank's body and continued his vigil. The paramedics arrived within 20 minutes, but their job was complicated by Caesar's presence. The lion had positioned himself between Frank and anyone who tried to approach, not aggressively, but with clear intent to protect. It took Dr. Whitfield's arrival with a mild sedative to calm Caesar, enough for the medical team to reach Frank. And even then, the lion maintained eye contact with his friend throughout the entire rescue operation. "I've never seen anything like this," paramedic Jake Rodriguez told his partner as they loaded Frank onto the stretcher. "That lion's acting like he's guarding a family member." Frank's vital signs were critical: severe hypothermia, cardiac arrest symptoms, and signs of near drowning. As the ambulance pulled away from the sanctuary, Caesar broke free from Dr. Whitfield's gentle restraint and followed the vehicle to the main road, running alongside until the ambulance outdistanced him. The lion then positioned himself at the sanctuary's entrance and began his vigil anew, refusing food and water while he waited for Frank's return. 300 miles away, Sarah Morrison Davidson was in the middle of a contentious deposition when her phone rang repeatedly. She had ignored the first 5 calls, but something about the persistence finally made her excuse herself from the conference room. Margaret Collins's voice was shaky with exhaustion and worry. "Sarah, your father's been rushed to Austin General Hospital. He nearly drowned trying to save one of our lions. The doctors, they're not sure he's going to make it." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She sank into a hallway chair, her mind struggling to process what Margaret was telling her. Her father, who couldn't even swim well according to childhood memories, had jumped into deep water to save a wild animal. It sounded insane, but Margaret's tears over the phone made it terrifyingly real. "I'm coming," Sarah said, already mentally calculating flight times. "Margaret, what happened?" Why was he even near the water? Margaret explained about the poisoned water supply, the threatening note, and Jackson Sterling's escalating pressure to sell the sanctuary. As the full picture emerged, Sarah felt a cold rage building in her chest. Someone had deliberately put those animals at risk, and her father had nearly died because of it. Sarah canceled her afternoon appointments and booked the first flight to Austin, but not before making one crucial call. Emma's school was understanding when Sarah explained the family emergency, and within an hour, both mother and daughter were on a plane to Texas. Emma clutched her stuffed lion throughout the flight, insisting that Caesar needed them to come quickly. The drive from Austin Airport to the hospital passed in a blur of unfamiliar Texas landscape and mounting anxiety. Emma had been unusually quiet since learning about Frank's condition, drawing pictures of lions and hospitals with her travel crayons. When Sarah tried to prepare her daughter for the possibility that Grandpa Frank might not wake up, Emma simply shook her head. "Caesar won't let him go," Emma said with 8-year-old certainty. "They're connected now." Austin General Hospital's ICU was a maze of white corridors and beeping machines that made Sarah's skin crawl with memories of her mother's final weeks. Dr. Miguel Torres met them at the nurses' station, his expression carefully neutral in the way that medical professionals learned when delivering difficult news. "Your father is stable for now," Dr. Torres explained, leading them toward Frank's room. "But I need you to understand the severity of his condition. He suffered a massive heart attack during the rescue, complicated by severe hypothermia and water inhalation. We've managed to restart his heart, but the next 48 hours will be critical." Sarah stopped walking. "Restart his heart?" "You mean he was clinically dead for approximately 4 minutes," Dr. Torres confirmed. "The fact that he's alive at all is remarkable. His age and pre-existing cardiac condition should have made survival impossible." Emma tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Can we see Caesar too?" Dr. Torres looked puzzled until Sarah explained about the lion. "Actually, that's another unusual aspect of this case," the doctor said. "There's a large animal in your parking lot that security can't remove. Animal control has tried tranquilizer darts, but the lion just sits there. It's been there for 6 hours now, not moving, not eating, just watching the building." Through Frank's ICU window, Sarah could see her father surrounded by monitors and machines, his weathered face pale as parchment. Tubes and wires connected him to devices that were keeping him alive, and for the first time in years, Sarah saw him as he really was, not the stubborn old man she had been fighting with, but her father, who was dying. Emma pressed her face against the glass. "Grandpa Frank looks scared," she observed with the brutal honesty of children. "He's just sleeping, honey," Sarah said, though her own voice shook. "No," Emma corrected. "He's scared because he thinks we're still mad at him." The truth of that statement hit Sarah like a sledgehammer. Their last conversation had been an argument about Frank's irresponsible obsession with those animals, when he had called to ask if Emma could visit the sanctuary for her birthday. Sarah had refused, citing concerns about safety and appropriate activities for children. Now, looking at her father's still form, she realized that call had been his way of trying to rebuild their relationship, and she had shut him down completely. Doctor. Torres allowed them into the room for short visits, warning that Frank's condition remained extremely fragile. Sarah took her father's hand, surprised by how small it felt. When had his strong carpenter's hands become so thin and cold? Emma climbed into the bedside chair and began talking quietly to her grandfather, telling him about school and her drawings and how Caesar was waiting outside for him. "The nurses say Caesar won't leave," Emma told Frank's unconscious form. "He knows you're in here, and he's making sure you're safe." As if summoned by Emma's words, a deep roar echoed across the hospital parking lot. Through the window, Sarah could see a crowd gathering around something in the distance. Hospital security guards stood helplessly beside a massive golden form that refused to be moved or intimidated. Margaret Collins arrived that evening with updates from the sanctuary and a better understanding of what had transpired. The investigation into the water contamination had revealed sophisticated sabotage. Industrial chemicals had been deliberately introduced into the emergency water supply, and security cameras had been disabled with professional precision. The threatening note left behind pointed clearly to Jackson Sterling's involvement, but proving it would require time they might not have. "The other animals are recovering," Margaret told Sarah as they sat in the hospital waiting room. "Dr. Whitfield managed to synthesize an antidote once he identified the specific toxins. But your father saved Caesar's life by getting him out of that water when he did. Another few minutes and the poisoning would have been irreversible." Sarah found herself thinking about Emma's drawings from that morning, the man and lion underwater together. How had her 8-year-old daughter somehow known what was going to happen? Emma's autism had always made her seem different, but perhaps that difference included insights that Sarah had been too skeptical to recognize. On the second day, Frank's condition took a turn for the worse. His heart, already damaged by decades of stress and his underlying condition, began showing signs of complete failure. Dr. Torres called Sarah into the hallway for a conversation she had been dreading. "Mrs. Davidson, I need to discuss your father's code status with you," Dr. Torres said gently. "His heart is failing, and we're reaching the limits of what medical intervention can accomplish. If he arrests again, we can attempt resuscitation, but given his age and the extent of the damage—" "He wouldn't want to be kept alive by machines," Sarah said, the words tearing at her throat. "But Dr. Torres, is there any chance? Any at all?" "There's always hope," the doctor replied diplomatically, but his expression told a different story. That night, Sarah sat beside Frank's bed while Emma slept curled up in the visitor's chair. The monitors showed Frank's weakening vital signs, and Sarah found herself talking to her unconscious father for the first time in years without anger or defensiveness. "Dad, I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry I was so stubborn, and I'm sorry I kept Emma away from you. You were right about her needing to spend time at the sanctuary. She's different, but it's a good different. She understands things the rest of us miss." Frank's eyelids fluttered slightly, and Sarah leaned closer. "Dad, can you hear me?" For a moment, Frank's eyes opened and focused on her face. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Sarah squeezed his hand, and he squeezed back, weakly, but unmistakably intentional. "Emma's here," Sarah told him. "She's been talking to Caesar for you. He's still outside, Dad. He's still waiting." Frank's eyes closed again, but his grip on Sarah's hand remained firm. Outside the window, Caesar's silhouette was visible in the parking lot lights, a massive shadow maintaining his patient vigil. Hospital staff had given up trying to move him, and someone had even set up a small shelter and water dish nearby. As dawn approached on the third day, Emma woke up and announced that she needed to see Caesar. Sarah initially refused, but Emma's distress was so acute that Dr. Torres suggested they allow it, with proper supervision. Hospital security escorted them to the parking lot, where Caesar lay in the makeshift shelter that volunteers had constructed. The lion's amber eyes immediately focused on Emma, and something extraordinary happened. Caesar slowly rose to his feet and approached the security barrier, his massive head lowering to Emma's eye level. Emma placed her small hand against the temporary fencing, and Caesar pressed his enormous paw against the same spot from the other side. "He says Grandpa Frank is fighting very hard," Emma announced to the gathering crowd. "But he needs to know we forgive him for being brave." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she watched her daughter communicate with the lion in ways that defied rational explanation. Caesar's responses to Emma seemed deliberate and specific, as if they were having an actual conversation. When Emma told Caesar that they loved Grandpa Frank and weren't angry anymore, the lion's demeanor shifted noticeably, from patient waiting to something that looked remarkably like relief. That afternoon, Frank Morrison opened his eyes and spoke his first words in 3 days. "How's Caesar?" Frank's recovery progressed slowly over the following weeks, but what captured national attention was not just his survival, it was Caesar's unwavering vigil outside the hospital. The lion had become a media sensation, with news crews from across the country documenting his daily routine of sitting by the hospital fence, waiting for his human friend to emerge. The story of an old veteran who nearly died saving a lion, and the lion who refused to abandon him, struck a chord that resonated far beyond Austin, Texas. Sarah found herself thrust into an unexpected role as family spokesperson, fielding calls from journalists, documentary filmmakers, and animal behaviorists who wanted to study the unprecedented bond between Frank and Caesar. She had taken a leave of absence from her Los Angeles law practice and rented a small apartment near the hospital, determined not to leave her father's side again. Emma, meanwhile, had become something of a celebrity herself, with her apparent ability to communicate with Caesar, drawing fascination from researchers and skepticism from others. Dr. Patricia Reynolds, a child psychologist from the University of Texas, arrived to study Emma's interactions with Caesar. What she witnessed challenged conventional understanding of autism and animal communication. Emma didn't just talk to Caesar. She seemed to understand his responses, translating the lion's various sounds, movements, and expressions into remarkably specific information about Frank's condition that often proved accurate. "This isn't anthropomorphization or a child's imagination," Dr. Reynolds confided to Sarah after a week of observation. "Emma is demonstrating genuine empathetic responses to Caesar's emotional state, and somehow interpreting those emotions in the context of your father's situation. I've never documented anything like this." The story took an unexpected turn when investigative journalist Maria Santos from the Austin American-Statesman began digging into the circumstances surrounding Frank's near drowning. Her investigation revealed a pattern of suspicious incidents at animal sanctuaries across Texas, all connected to properties that Jackson Sterling's development company had later acquired at below-market prices. The water contamination at Big Cat Sanctuary wasn't random vandalism. It was part of a systematic campaign to force financially struggling sanctuaries into bankruptcy. Jackson Sterling had remained largely out of the public eye since Frank's hospitalization, but Maria's reporting forced him into the spotlight. When confronted with evidence of the sabotage campaign, Sterling's response was both defensive and revealing. "Frank Morrison has been living in the past for 40 years, Sterling told Maria during a tense interview. "He thinks he's still some kind of war hero, but the truth is he's a broken-down old man who nearly got himself killed for a wild animal. These sanctuaries are accidents waiting to happen, and I'm providing a service by developing the land for better use." But Sterling's public relations offensive backfired when Dr. James Whitfield, the sanctuary's veterinarian, came forward with detailed analysis of the water contamination. The specific combination of industrial chemicals found in the emergency reservoir wasn't something that could have occurred naturally or through simple negligence. It required knowledge of animal physiology and deliberate intent to cause maximum harm. Frank, still recovering in the hospital, watched the news coverage with growing anger. Sarah noticed her father's increased agitation whenever Sterling appeared on television, his heart monitor showing elevated readings that concerned the medical staff. When she asked about his obvious distress, Frank initially remained silent, but Emma's presence seemed to lower his defenses. "There's something about Sterling I never told anyone," Frank finally admitted, his voice hoarse from weeks of medical procedures. "We knew each other a long time ago. Vietnam. He was in my unit for 6 months before being transferred out." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "Dad, what happened in Vietnam?" Frank closed his eyes, and for a moment Sarah thought he wasn't going to answer. But when he opened them again, she saw a pain that went deeper than his physical injuries. "Firebase Charlie, 1983, Frank began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sterling was supposed to lead a rescue mission for 6 soldiers pinned down by enemy fire. When the shooting started, he froze up. Just stood there while good men were dying 50 yards away." Emma climbed into Frank's hospital bed and curled up beside him, her small presence seeming to give him strength to continue. "I wasn't supposed to go. Orders were to hold position. But I couldn't listen to those boys calling for help and do nothing. So I disobeyed orders and went after them. Got 5 of the 6 out alive, took shrapnel in my chest for the trouble." Sarah's mind raced, trying to understand the implications. "What happened to Sterling?" "That's the thing," Frank continued, his hand finding Emma's small one. "When we got back to base, Sterling filed a report claiming he led the rescue mission. Said I was his backup. Command believed him. He was an officer, I was just a sergeant. He got a commendation and I got a reprimand for abandoning my post." The pieces began falling into place for Sarah. "The Purple Heart in your pocket? You earned it for that rescue?" Frank nodded slowly. "The 5 soldiers I saved, they made sure I got the medal, even if the official record was wrong. They knew what really happened. But Sterling spent the next 40 years believing his own lie, thinking he was the hero of that story. And now he's trying to destroy the sanctuary because of what happened in Vietnam." Sarah's legal mind was already working through the implications. "I think he's been carrying that guilt and anger for 4 decades, Frank said. "When he saw me at the sanctuary, it all came back. He probably figured if he could prove I was just a crazy old man who risked his life for animals, it would somehow validate his version of events from the war." Emma looked up at her grandfather with serious 8-year-old eyes. "Caesar says Mr. Sterling is scared of you because you're really brave and he's not." Frank smiled for the first time in days. "Tell Caesar I said being brave isn't about not being scared, sweetheart. It's about doing the right thing even when you are scared." The revelation about Frank and Sterling's shared history added new dimensions to the story that continued to capture national attention. GoFundMe campaigns sprung up to support both Frank's medical expenses and the sanctuary's financial crisis. Donations poured in from veterans organizations, animal lovers, and ordinary people moved by the story of extraordinary loyalty between species. But the most significant development came when General Patricia Hawkins, Frank's former commanding officer, arrived at the hospital with a file folder that would change everything. General Hawkins had spent 3 weeks reviewing classified military records from Firebase Charlie, and what she discovered contradicted the official story that had stood for 40 years. "Frank, I owe you an apology," General Hawkins said, her voice heavy with emotion. "The Army got it wrong in 1983, and it's taken us too long to set the record straight." She opened the folder to reveal witness statements from the soldiers Frank had rescued, statements that had been buried in bureaucratic filing systems for decades. Each statement corroborated Frank's version of events, describing how Sterling had frozen under fire and how Frank had single-handedly carried out the rescue mission that saved their lives. Jackson Sterling was court-martialed 6 months after Firebase Charlie for conduct unbecoming an officer, General Hawkins continued. He was discharged quietly to avoid scandal, but his military record tells the real story. You were the hero that day, Frank, and it's time the world knew it. Sarah watched her father's face as General Hawkins presented him with updated military records officially crediting him with the rescue at Firebase Charlie. For the first time since she'd arrived in Austin, Frank looked genuinely at peace. "It was never about the medals," Frank said quietly. "I just wanted those boys to come home." "And they did, because of you," General Hawkins replied. "2 of them are flying in from Oregon tomorrow to see you. They've been trying to track you down for years to thank you properly." Emma, who had been listening intently to the adult conversation, suddenly brightened. "Caesar wants to know if this means Mr. Sterling will stop being mean to the animals." The question hung in the air as all the adults realized that Frank's vindication was only part of the equation. Jackson Sterling's development company was still pushing for the sanctuary's foreclosure, still threatening the home that had given both Frank and Caesar purpose in their later years. The legal and financial battles were far from over, but now they had something they hadn't possessed before: the truth, and a growing army of supporters who believed in the power of loyalty, courage, and second chances. Outside the hospital window, Caesar maintained his patient vigil, a living symbol of the bonds that transcended species, circumstances, and the passage of time. His presence had become a source of comfort not just for Frank's family, but for the dozens of visitors who came daily to witness the unprecedented display of animal devotion. Children brought drawings, veterans shared their own stories of loyalty and sacrifice, and animal lovers from around the world sent messages of support. Frank's recovery was far from complete, but for the first time since the drowning incident, Sarah felt genuine hope that her father would not just survive, but thrive. The man who had spent 40 years carrying the weight of unrecognized heroism was finally receiving the acknowledgement he deserved, and perhaps more importantly, he was rebuilding the family relationships that had sustained him through his darkest hours. The crushing news came on a gray Tuesday morning when Frank had been making steady progress toward full recovery. Dr. Torres entered the hospital room with the expression that medical families learn to dread: professional composure masking devastating information. Sarah felt her stomach drop even before the doctor spoke, and Emma seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere, moving closer to her grandfather's bedside. "Frank, I'm afraid we've discovered complications from your cardiac episode," Dr. Torres began carefully. "The damage to your heart muscle was more extensive than we initially realized. We're looking at severe cardiomyopathy with significant reduction in pumping capacity." Frank's weathered hand found Emma's small one as he processed the medical terminology. "Doc, just give it to me straight. How long do I have?" Sarah felt the room spin around her. They had been so focused on Frank's recovery from the drowning incident that the possibility of his heart condition worsening hadn't seemed real, but Dr. Torres' next words confirmed her worst fears. "Without a heart transplant, which your age makes unlikely, we're probably looking at 6 to 8 months. I'm sorry, Frank. The strain from the rescue, combined with your pre-existing condition, has accelerated the deterioration significantly." Emma's grip on Frank's hand tightened, and she looked up at him with eyes that seemed far too wise for an 8-year-old. "Grandpa Frank, Caesar says your heart isn't broken, it's just tired from being so brave." Outside the hospital window, Caesar's vigil continued unchanged. The lion had been maintaining his post for nearly 3 weeks now, accepting food and water from volunteers but never straying more than a few yards from the building where Frank was healing. The international media attention had turned Caesar into a symbol of loyalty and devotion, but to Frank's family, he remained simply the friend who refused to give up. The news of Frank's terminal diagnosis leaked to the media within hours, despite the family's request for privacy. Suddenly, the story transformed from one of miraculous rescue and recovery to a tragic countdown that captured hearts around the world. The sanctuary's fundraising campaign, which had been gaining momentum, exploded into a massive international effort as people realized that Frank might not live to see his beloved animals saved. Margaret Collins arrived at the hospital that afternoon with tears streaming down her face and foreclosure papers in her hand. "Frank, I'm so sorry," she sobbed. "Sterling's lawyers filed an emergency motion. We have 72 hours to pay the full debt, or they're seizing the sanctuary. With you in the hospital, I don't know how to fight this." Frank struggled to sit up straighter in his hospital bed, his face flushing with anger that made his heart monitor beep alarmingly. "That son of a bitch is using my condition against us. He knows I can't be there to help with the legal battle." Sarah placed a restraining hand on her father's shoulder. "Dad, you need to stay calm. Let me handle Sterling." But Frank's mind was already working through the implications. If the sanctuary was seized and sold, Caesar and the other animals would be shipped to different facilities, or worse, the bond between Frank and Caesar, which had sustained both of them through their darkest hours, would be severed just when Frank needed it most. The thought of dying while knowing that Caesar had been abandoned to an uncertain fate was unbearable. Jackson Sterling chose that moment to make his most audacious move yet. He arrived at the hospital unannounced, somehow bypassing security to appear in Frank's room like a specter from the past. Sarah immediately moved to call security, but Frank stopped her with a gesture. "Let him talk," Frank said quietly. "I want to hear what he has to say." Sterling looked older than his 48 years, his expensive suit unable to hide the toll that 40 years of guilt and anger had taken on him. When he spoke, his voice carried a mixture of desperation and long suppressed rage. "You ruined my life, Morrison," Sterling said, his composure cracking. "Do you know what it's like to live with everyone thinking you're a hero when you know you're a coward? I've spent 4 decades trying to prove I'm worth something, and everywhere I turn, there you are, still playing the righteous soldier." Frank studied Sterling's face, seeing not the successful businessman, but the terrified young officer who had frozen under fire all those years ago. "Jackson, I never told anyone what really happened at Firebase Charlie. You built your own prison." "Because you were the better man," Sterling exploded, his voice echoing in the small hospital room. "Every day I had to live knowing that you saved those soldiers while I hid behind a bunker. Every success I achieved felt like a lie, because I knew what I really was." Emma, who had been quietly observing the confrontation, suddenly spoke up with the devastating honesty that only children possess. "You're not a bad man, Mr. Sterling. You're just scared." Caesar was scared too when he first came to Grandpa Frank. But Grandpa Frank helped him not be scared anymore. Sterling's face crumpled at Emma's words, 40 years of suppressed emotion finally breaking through his carefully constructed facade. "I can't undo what I did in Vietnam," he whispered, "but I can't let him win again. I can't let everyone see him as the hero while I'm still the coward." Sarah felt a surge of clarity as she watched Sterling's breakdown. This wasn't about business or development deals. It was about a broken man desperately trying to rewrite history by destroying the living reminder of his greatest failure. But understanding Sterling's motivation didn't diminish the very real threat he posed to everything Frank cared about. Frank's voice, when he finally spoke, was gentle but firm. "Jackson, you want to prove you're not a coward? Stop this legal attack on the sanctuary. Face the truth about Firebase Charlie and help me make sure these animals are taken care of after I'm gone." But Sterling's response revealed the depth of his psychological wounds. "No," he said, backing toward the door. "I've come too far to stop now. If I can't be the hero, then I'll make sure you're not remembered as one either." When that sanctuary is gone and those animals are scattered, no one will remember Frank Morrison as anything but a crazy old man who died for nothing. After Sterling left, the room fell into heavy silence. Emma climbed back onto Frank's bed and curled up against his side, her small presence providing comfort that no amount of medical intervention could match. Sarah sat in the bedside chair, her legal mind already working through possible strategies to fight Sterling's foreclosure motion, but her heart breaking at the realization that her father's time was running out. "Dad," Sarah said quietly, "what if we can't save the sanctuary in time?" Frank was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the window where Caesar's silhouette was visible in the afternoon light. "Then I want you to promise me something," he finally said. "Make sure Caesar finds a good home. Somewhere they'll understand that he's not just a lion, he's family." Emma looked up at her grandfather with tears in her eyes. "Caesar says he doesn't want a new home. He wants to stay with us." "I know, sweetheart," Frank whispered, kissing the top of Emma's head. "But sometimes we have to let go of the people we love so they can be safe and happy." That evening, as Frank slept fitfully under sedation to manage his worsening heart condition, Sarah made a series of phone calls that would determine the fate of everyone she loved. She contacted the media outlets covering the story, veterans organizations that had rallied around Frank's cause, and animal rights groups that had embraced Caesar's vigil as a symbol of interspecies love. The next morning brought news that would change everything. The GoFundMe campaign had reached $1.8 million overnight, fueled by international outrage over Sterling's attempt to seize the sanctuary while Frank lay dying. But more importantly, two of the soldiers Frank had saved at Firebase Charlie, David Chen and Robert Martinez, had arrived in Austin with their own plan to honor the man who had risked everything to bring them home. As Frank's family prepared for what might be their final battle to save the sanctuary, Caesar remained at his post outside the hospital, a living testament to the power of loyalty and love to transcend the boundaries between species, between past and present, between hope and despair. The lion's patient vigil had become more than just a news story. It had become a symbol of everything worth fighting for in a world that often seemed to have forgotten the meaning of devotion. The revelation came from the most unexpected source, Jackson Sterling's own corporate files, leaked by a whistleblower who could no longer stomach what the company had become. Maria Santos received the documents at 2 a.m. on Thursday morning, just hours before the emergency foreclosure hearing that would determine the sanctuary's fate. What she discovered in those files went far beyond simple real estate fraud and struck at the heart of everything Frank Morrison had believed about honor, sacrifice, and the meaning of heroism. The leaked documents revealed that Jackson Sterling's development company had been systematically targeting animal sanctuaries across the Southwest for more than a decade, but the Big Cat Sanctuary held special significance for Sterling personally. Internal emails showed that he had been monitoring Frank's activities for years, tracking his employment at the sanctuary through private investigators and waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. The water contamination wasn't just business, it was personal revenge 40 years in the making. But the most shocking revelation came in a recorded phone conversation between Sterling and his lead attorney discussing the legal strategy for seizing the sanctuary. In the recording, Sterling's voice was clearly audible. "I don't care what it costs. Morrison thinks he's some kind of war hero, but I'm going to prove he's just a pathetic old man who dies for nothing. When those animals are gone and that sanctuary is a parking lot, no one will remember Frank Morrison at all." Sarah listened to the recording in her hotel room while Frank slept in the hospital. And for the first time since arriving in Austin, she felt something beyond grief and desperation. She felt the cold, focused anger that had made her one of Los Angeles' most formidable divorce attorneys. Sterling had made this personal, And now she was going to destroy him with the same methodical precision she had used to dismantle lying spouses for over a decade. The emergency hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m. at the Travis County Courthouse, and Sarah knew she had less than 7 hours to prepare a defense that would not only save the sanctuary, but expose Sterling's criminal conspiracy. She called in favors from her former law school classmates, hired a local litigation support team, and began building a case that would turn Sterling's moment of triumph into his final defeat. At 6 a.m., Frank insisted on being discharged from the hospital against medical advice. Dr. Torres argued strenuously against it, pointing out that Frank's heart condition made any stress potentially fatal, but Frank was adamant. "I'm not going to let that son of a bitch take my sanctuary while I'm lying in a hospital bed," he declared, signing the discharge papers with a shaking hand. Caesar seemed to sense the significance of the moment. As Frank emerged from the hospital in a wheelchair pushed by Sarah, the lion rose from his weeks-long vigil and approached the exit slowly, his massive head lowered in what looked remarkably like a bow of respect. Emma ran to the temporary fence separating them from Caesar, and the lion gently pressed his enormous paw against her small hand through the chain link. "He says you're still the bravest person he knows," Emma told her grandfather, translating Caesar's low rumble into words that somehow made perfect sense to everyone present. The courthouse was surrounded by media trucks and supporters by the time Frank's family arrived. Veterans in uniform lined the steps, holding signs reading, "Heroes don't abandon heroes," and "Caesar's Army stands with Frank." Animal rights activists had driven from across Texas to show their support, and even children from Emma's former school in California had sent video messages expressing their love for the man who saved the lion. But the most powerful moment came when David Chen and Robert Martinez, the two soldiers Frank had rescued at Fire Base Charlie, stepped forward to escort Frank's wheelchair up the courthouse steps. Both men were in their 60s now, successful in their post-military careers, but they had never forgotten the sergeant who had disobeyed orders to save their lives. "Frank Morrison is the reason my grandchildren know their grandfather," Chen told the assembled reporters. "He risked everything for us 40 years ago, and we're here to make sure he doesn't face this fight alone." Inside the courtroom, Sterling's legal team had prepared what they believed would be a routine foreclosure proceeding. The sanctuary owed $250,000 in documented debts, and they had engineered the financial crisis that made payment impossible. But they weren't prepared for Sarah Morrison Davidson's opening statement, delivered with the precision of a surgeon and the passion of a daughter fighting for her father's life. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom, "this case is not about real estate law or debt collection. This is about a decades-long conspiracy by Jackson Sterling to destroy a man whose only crime was being a better soldier than Sterling could ever hope to be." She presented the leaked documents methodically, building a case that showed how Sterling had deliberately sabotaged the sanctuary's water system, manipulated the financial crisis, and accelerated the foreclosure timeline to coincide with Frank's hospitalization. Each piece of evidence painted Sterling not as a legitimate businessman, but as a vindictive criminal who had spent 40 years nursing a grudge. But the most devastating moment came when Sarah played the recorded phone conversation in which Sterling described his plan to erase Frank's legacy by destroying everything he cared about. The courtroom fell silent as Sterling's own words condemned him, his voice dripping with malice as he described Frank as a pathetic old man who dies for nothing. Judge Harold Williams, himself a Vietnam veteran, listened to the recording with an expression of growing disgust. When it ended, he looked directly at Sterling and spoke with barely controlled anger. "Mr. Sterling, in 30 years on this bench, I have never seen such a calculated attempt to destroy a man's life out of personal spite." Sterling's attorney tried to object, claiming the recordings were illegally obtained, but the damage was done. The FBI agents who had been investigating the sanctuary contamination were already in the courtroom, and they moved to arrest Sterling before he could leave his table. As Sterling was led away in handcuffs, he turned back toward Frank with a final desperate attempt at justification. "You think you're better than me, Morrison, but you're just an old man dying alone while I built an empire." Frank struggled to his feet from his wheelchair, supported by David Chen and Robert Martinez, and looked Sterling directly in the eyes. "Jackson, I never thought I was better than you. I just tried to do the right thing. The difference is, I'm not dying alone." As if to prove Frank's point, Caesar's roar echoed across the courthouse steps, a sound of triumph that seemed to shake the building's foundations. The lion had somehow sensed the outcome of the hearing, and his call was answered by similar sounds from the sanctuary, where the other rescued animals seemed to understand that their home had been saved. Judge Williams dismissed all foreclosure proceedings against the sanctuary and ordered Sterling's assets frozen pending criminal investigation. The $1.8 million raised through crowdfunding would be more than enough to secure the sanctuary's future and expand its educational programs. But more importantly, Frank's reputation had been restored, and Sterling's 40-year campaign of revenge had finally ended in complete defeat. The courtroom erupted in celebration as supporters realized that Frank had won his final battle. Veterans cheered, animal lovers wept with joy, and Emma climbed into her grandfather's lap to hug him with 8-year-old enthusiasm. Frank felt tears streaming down his face as he realized that Caesar would be safe, the sanctuary would continue its mission, and his legacy would be one of love rather than loss. Outside the courthouse, Caesar waited patiently for Frank's return, surrounded by supporters who had maintained their own vigil throughout the hearing. When Frank's wheelchair emerged from the building, the lion rose slowly and approached the fence, with what could only be described as dignity. The crowd fell silent as Emma translated Caesar's low rumble. "He says thank you for keeping your promise to take care of everyone." Dr. Torres had warned that the stress of the hearing could trigger another heart attack, but Frank felt stronger than he had in weeks. The weight of 40 years of guilt and anger had been lifted from his shoulders, replaced by the knowledge that everything he had fought for would survive long after he was gone. Sarah looked at her father with new understanding and respect. She had spent years seeing him as a stubborn old man obsessed with animals, but now she realized he was something far more important, a man who had spent his entire life putting others before himself, whether they were soldiers under fire, a grieving lion, or a granddaughter who needed to understand that being different was actually being special. As Frank's family prepared to return to the sanctuary for the first time since the drowning incident, they carried with them the knowledge that they had not just saved a piece of land or a collection of animals, they had preserved something far more precious, the living proof that love, loyalty, and courage could triumph over hatred, spite, and the desire for revenge. The battle was over, but the real victory was just beginning. 6 months later, Frank Morrison stood at the entrance of what was now officially called the Morrison-Davidson Wildlife Education Center, watching his granddaughter Emma lead a group of children with autism through their weekly animal therapy session. The transformation had been remarkable. Not just of the sanctuary, which now boasted state-of-the-art facilities and educational programs, but of the people whose lives had been forever changed by Caesar's unwavering loyalty and Frank's impossible courage. Emma had blossomed into the sanctuary's most effective young ambassador, her unique ability to communicate with the animals making her invaluable in helping other children overcome their own social challenges. The little girl who had once struggled to connect with human classmates now served as a bridge between two worlds, translating the emotional needs of both rescued animals and visiting children with a wisdom that continued to astonish child psychologists and animal behaviorists alike. Caesar says the new boy in the red shirt is sad about his parents' divorce, Emma told Dr. Patricia Reynolds, who had taken a sabbatical from the University of Texas to study the sanctuary's therapeutic programs full-time. He needs to pet Caesar's mane, but slowly, so Caesar can share some brave feelings with him. Dr. Reynolds watched in amazement as 8-year-old Tommy Martinez, who hadn't spoken since his parents' bitter separation 3 months earlier, approached Caesar's enclosure with tentative steps. The massive lion, now 16 years old and moving more slowly but still regal in his bearing, lowered his great head to the fence level where Tommy could reach through to touch his golden mane. And the moment of contact seemed to transform both child and lion. Tommy's tense shoulders relaxed, and Caesar emitted the low, rumbling purr that had become his signature expression of contentment. "Mama?" Tommy whispered, the first word he had spoken in months. "The big kitty says it's okay to miss Daddy, even when he can't live with us anymore." Sarah Morrison Davidson, now the sanctuary's full-time legal director and Frank's partner in expanding the facility's mission, watched the interaction from the observation deck with tears in her eyes. Her decision to leave her lucrative Los Angeles practice had seemed impulsive at the time, but seeing the daily miracles that occurred when damaged souls, both human and animal, found healing together, she knew she had finally found her true calling. Frank's own health had stabilized remarkably over the past months. While his heart condition remained serious, the reduced stress of knowing the sanctuary was secure, combined with the daily joy of watching Caesar interact with visitors, had given him a quality of life that Dr. Torres admitted defied medical explanation. Frank liked to joke that Caesar was sharing more than just his mane with visitors. He was sharing years of his own life with the man who had saved him. The sanctuary now hosted programs for veterans with PTSD, children with developmental challenges, elderly residents from assisted living facilities, and families dealing with trauma or loss. Caesar had become the star of these programs, demonstrating an almost supernatural ability to sense who needed his attention most. The lion, who had once been broken by captivity and abuse, had transformed into a healer, offering comfort to anyone who approached him with genuine need. David Chen and Robert Martinez, the soldiers Frank had rescued at Firebase Charlie, had become regular volunteers at the sanctuary, helping with the veterans' therapy programs and sharing their own stories of survival and recovery. Their presence provided Frank with a living link to his military service and proof that his sacrifice had created ripple effects of goodness that continued to spread decades later. "You know, Frank," David said one afternoon as they watched Caesar work with a group of Iraq War veterans, "I used to think you saved our lives in Vietnam. But watching what you've built here, I realize you did something even more important. You showed us how to save others." Jackson Sterling's fate had been sealed by his own recorded words and the overwhelming evidence of his systematic campaign against animal sanctuaries. Sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for conspiracy, fraud, and animal cruelty, he had been stripped of his business empire and ordered to pay restitution to all the sanctuaries he had targeted. But in an unexpected twist, Sterling had reached out to Frank from prison, requesting a meeting that would test the limits of forgiveness and redemption. The meeting took place on a crisp December morning, with Sterling arriving at the sanctuary in shackles and accompanied by federal marshals. Frank had agreed to the visit partly out of curiosity and partly because Emma had insisted that Mr. Sterling's heart is still broken and maybe Caesar can help fix it. Sterling looked older than his 58 years, his expensive suits replaced by prison orange, and his arrogant demeanor replaced by something that looked remarkably like humility. When he saw Caesar in his enclosure, surrounded by visiting children who showed no fear of the massive predator, Sterling's composure finally cracked completely. "I spent 40 years hating the wrong person," Sterling whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I hated you for being brave when I was a coward, but I should have been learning from you instead of trying to destroy you." Frank studied the broken man who had tried so hard to erase his legacy and felt something he hadn't expected: pity. "Jackson, it's not too late to learn. Even in prison you can choose to help instead of hurt." Sterling nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on Caesar, who was gently nuzzling a young girl with cerebral palsy. "I want to make amends, Frank. I don't know how, but I want to try." Over the following months, Sterling began corresponding with Frank from prison, sharing stories of his childhood trauma and the fears that had driven his destructive behavior. Frank responded with letters describing the sanctuary's programs and the daily miracles of healing they witnessed. Gradually, Sterling began contributing to the sanctuary's mission from behind bars, using his business knowledge to help other struggling animal rescue organizations avoid the financial traps he had once set for them. As Christmas approached, Frank found himself surrounded by a family he had never dared to hope for. Sarah and Emma living full-time at the sanctuary, volunteers who had become like children to him, rescued animals who depended on his care, and Caesar, the friend who had taught him that love and loyalty could transcend every boundary. Standing beside Caesar's enclosure as snow began to fall gently across the Texas hills, Frank felt a peace he had never known was possible. The lion looked up at him with those wise amber eyes and emitted the soft rumble that Emma always translated as, "Thank you for saving me." But Frank knew the truth was more complex than that. He and Caesar had saved each other, and in doing so, they had created something beautiful enough to heal a broken world, one heart at a time. Dear friends, Frank Morrison's story reminds us that it's never too late for second chances, and sometimes our greatest purpose reveals itself in our later years. At 67, facing a terminal diagnosis and estranged from his daughter, Frank could have given up. Instead, he found meaning in caring for Caesar, a broken lion who needed the same healing Frank was seeking. Their bond proved that love doesn't diminish with age, it deepens, becoming more precious because we understand how fleeting it can be. Frank's courage to risk everything for someone he loved, Sarah's willingness to forgive and rebuild their relationship, and Emma's gift for seeing beyond differences all speak to the wisdom that comes with experience. We may feel forgotten in a youth-obsessed world, but Frank's story shows that our capacity for heroism, compassion, and transformation actually grows stronger with time. The sanctuary Frank saved became a place where broken souls, both human and animal, found healing together. His legacy wasn't built in his 20s or 40s, but in his final years, proving that our most important chapters might still be unwritten. What second chances are you grateful for in your own life? Have you ever found unexpected purpose or meaning after facing loss or disappointment? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone who needs to hear it today.